U.S. pilots captured Soviet AK-47 in Korea, dropped it in mud, froze it in ice, still fired perfectly, while M14 jammed November 27, 1950. 05:42 a.m. east of the Chosin Reservoir, North Korea. The cold made a sound, thin, glassy, like breath drawn through a reed. Frost clung to the canvas of the Jeep as Major Robert Hayes stepped out and felt his boots skate on powder snow hardened into ice. Down in the ravine, a wrecked fuselage steamed like a wounded animal, the hot metal ticking as it met sub-zero air. The sabres had tangled with MiGs before dawn, quick contrails stitched across a pale sky. One silver jet fell, not in flame, but in silence, coasting into the valley and breaking itself against frozen earth. The man inside wore nothing that named him, no unit, no flag, only flight gear dusted white, and a face with that empty calm the cold gives the newly dead. Hayes wasn't there for the plane. He was there because the ordnance boys swore they'd found a rifle unlike any they'd seen. He ducked under a bent spar, the aluminum groaning above him, and saw it resting where it had skidded free, shorter than a Garand, heavier in the hand than it looked, with a banana-curved magazine and stamped steel that seemed almost crude beside American machining. He brushed ice crystals from the receiver, Cyrillic marks, a date, 1949. The metal bit his glove when he racked the charge's handle. The bolt ran home with a flat, confident clack. No oil sheen, no careful armory perfume, just steel, wood, and purpose. "Sir?" his sergeant called from the ridge. "You want we bag it with the cockpit instruments?" "Not like the instruments," Hayes said, his voice a cloud in the air, like a question with teeth. He kneaded the stock with a thumb, the shellac gritty beneath the frost, and imagined what this thing would do in a thaw, mud sucking at knees, powder fouling every oiled seam, rain turning trenches to soup. He'd spent a war with rifles that loved to be clean. This one looked built to be dirty, built to be dropped, kicked, buried, found, and still speak when a man needed a loud, simple answer. They tested it right there, because a battlefield is its own proving ground. He slammed a full magazine in until it clicked, shouldered the gun over a wool coat stiff as bark, and sighted on a black knot of pine across the ravine. The trigger broke without poetry. The weapon coughed, steady and indifferent, brass flaring from the ejection port to rattle against frozen stone. No hesitation, no stutter. The smell was hot coin and cordite, and the recoil came straight back, honest and forgiving. He lowered the rifle and listened. The valley gave him his breath back. The MiG ticked in the cold. Behind him, someone muttered, "Hell, Major, it's ugly." Hayes nodded. Ugly's a compliment in weather like this. Later, they would drop it into meltwater, rake it through slush, and lock it overnight in a block of ice to see if the bolt would still run in the morning. But at that blade-thin hour, with a war moving like a snowstorm across mountains and roads that broke men before bullets did, all he knew was this: sometimes the machine that wins isn't the one that shines. It's the one that breathes when the air itself wants to kill you. We thought the cold would silence everything. It didn't. Before the war, Robert Hayes was not a man who believed in simplicity. He believed in craftsmanship, in polished walnut stocks, in precision-machined bolts that clicked like watch gears, in the gospel of American engineering. He was born in Wichita, Kansas in 1915, a farmer's son who spent more time taking apart his father's tractor than helping plow the field. By 17, he could disassemble a Springfield rifle blindfolded. By 25, He was teaching weapons maintenance at Lowry Air Base. He wasn't built for glamour. He was the man behind the man with the gun, the one who taught others how to clean, adjust, and trust their tools. A rifle, he used to tell his trainees, is like an airplane. If it jams, it kills you second. It kills your buddy first. He enlisted in 1941 because he thought he understood machines. He thought war was just engineering with higher stakes. But when the bombers screamed over France and men vanished under fire, he realized machines were just the start. It was men who failed and men who endured. After the war, when the Air Force split from the Army, he stayed in uniform. One of those officers who never looked entirely at home in dress blues. He had a mechanic's hands, thick and square, always slightly stained with oil no matter how much he washed them. When the Korean War began in 1950, Hayes was stationed in Japan, part of the logistics division tasked with recovering and analyzing enemy equipment. He'd seen Japanese Arisakas, German Mausers, even captured STG-44s brought from Europe. Each time, he admired their design, but never envied it. American steel, he believed, was still the standard. Then came the call from Chosin, a downed MiG, a dead pilot, a strange rifle with Cyrillic markings. To most officers, it was just a curiosity. To Hayes, it was a whisper in the wind, a message from a future he didn't yet understand. That night in Tokyo, before the rifle arrived for inspection, he wrote a note in his field journal. If the Soviets are given their pilots automatic rifles, they're not thinking like us anymore. They're preparing for something else, a kind of war that doesn't care how clean the weapon is, only that it fires when it's filthy. He thought of his wife, Margaret, back in Seattle, her letters full of news about ration coupons, their son's first words, the dog chewing through the back fence. She thought his work was boring, safe, just testing guns, she'd written, not using them, thank God. He smiled at that. He'd seen too much to tell her the truth, that studying weapons was just another way of fighting, only slower, quieter, and far more permanent. He didn't know it yet, but that rifle, the one resting in a crate bound for his desk, would haunt him for the rest of his life, because it wasn't just another piece of enemy gear. It was a window into a philosophy that would outlive both him and the war. And before the snow melted in Korea, Major Robert Hayes would come to understand that the Soviets hadn't just built a weapon. They'd built an idea, one that would bury his faith in complexity forever. Tokyo, December 12th, 1950. The wind that morning smelled of oil and ozone. The test range stretched along a black volcanic slope outside Tachikawa Air Base, a long ribbon of mud frozen solid under the boots of men who didn't want to be there. Major Robert Hayes stood beside the test officer, his breath ghosting around the clipboard in his hand. On the wooden table in front of him lay two rifles, an M1 Garand and the captured Soviet piece, the one with the Cyrillic scarring and the dented stock. Both looked exhausted, as if they'd been dragged across 3 continents. Hayes ran a finger along the AK's cold receiver. It felt coarse, industrial, as if it had been built by men who cared more about outcome than aesthetics. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what kind of bastard this thing really is." The technician nodded, loaded the curved magazine, and stepped onto the firing line. The Garand went first. 8 crisp shots, precise, polite, and then a soft metallic ping as the clip ejected. Hayes could almost hear John Garand's ghost purring in satisfaction. Then they buried it halfway in slush, rolled it in gravel, and tried again. It fired once, jammed, spat out a mangled casing. Hayes winced. All right. Clean it! Reset! Now the Soviet gun. The air felt heavier. The tech dunked it straight into a bucket of slurry, mud sliding into every seam. No ceremony, no reverence, just grime and gravity. He shook it once, aimed, and squeezed. The rifle coughed, once, twice, then sang. The bolt slammed forward, cases flew sideways like sparks from an anvil. Hayes felt it in his chest, a steady, hammering rhythm. 60 rounds in 6 seconds. Not smooth, but alive. When it stopped, the smell of cordite hung thick in the cold air. Hayes stepped closer, pressed his glove to the receiver. It was hot, but not angry. He looked at the mud still clinging to the piston tube and whispered, "You shouldn't be working right now." The tech grinned. Guess it didn't get the memo. They ran the tests again and again until the barrels steamed and the snow around them turned black. The Garand choked every time the dirt got in. The AK never once quit. At lunch, inside the hangar, the team sat around a steel drum of coffee gone bitter. One of the ordnance captains shook his head. "Sir, it's ugly, crude. Half the machining looks like it was done by farmers. But I can't make it stop shooting." Hayes didn't answer. He was staring at the open receiver under the light. It wasn't elegant, but it was logical. Wide clearances, forgiving gaps, springs thick as piano wire. You could lose a screw and it would still function. Lose oil, lose care, lose everything but courage. It would still go on. He thought of the American rifles polished in factories, the soldiers told to love their weapons like wives. The Soviets had built something you didn't love. You used it, you abused it, and it would forgive you for both. That night, back in his quarters, Hayes wrote only one sentence in his logbook. "We build for perfection. They build for survival. And survival always wins first." Outside, snow fell softly over Tokyo, muffling the city into quiet. Inside, Hayes sat with the weapon disassembled across his desk, the parts laid out like organs from some mechanical creature. Each one had a purpose. Each one looked as if it had learned to live with pain. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter, because for the first time he realized that America might be fighting the wrong kind of war with the wrong kind of faith. January 4th, 1951, Tachikawa Test Range, Japan. The snow had turned to sleet that day, a fine freezing rain that cut like glass when the wind shifted. Hayes stood beside a pit of mud and ice, his collar pulled up against the sting. Around him, technicians moved with the stiff precision of men working in cold too deep to think. On a bench nearby sat a lineup of rifles: the American M1 Garand, the lighter M1 carbine, an experimental M14 prototype, and the captured Soviet AK-47. Each looked proud in its own way. The Garand with its oiled walnut stock, the carbine with its compact lines, the M14 with its air of refinement. Only the AK looked indifferent, its stamped steel glistening wet and dark like a tool left in the rain. Hayes wasn't testing beauty. He was testing truth. "All right," he said to the men, "let's see which one keeps talking after the storm hits." They began with the simplest cruelty: mud immersion. Each weapon was submerged in a barrel of mixed earth and water, stirred until bubbles rose to the surface. The rifles came out caked, dripping, heavy. Hayes watched as the first technician chambered around in the Garand, wiped the receiver with a rag, and squeezed. Bang, bang, click. The bolt jammed halfway open. He moved on to the carbine. 2 shots. Jam. The M14, same story. precision choked by filth. Then came the Soviet rifle. The tech plunged it into the same pit, twisted it under, and pulled it free. He didn't even clean the muzzle. He simply racked the bolt and fired. The gun answered with a violent rhythm, spitting mud and brass in equal measure. 60 rounds, no jam, no hesitation. When it stopped, only the echo of it remained, a deep, pulsing heartbeat against the mountain fog. One of the younger engineers swore under his breath, "It's like it wants to live." Hayes nodded. That's exactly what it wants. Next came the cold test. Each rifle was soaked in water, then locked overnight in the outdoor freezer, minus 35 degrees. In the morning, frost welded the bolts shut like concrete. The Garand's handle refused to move until they warmed it with a blowtorch. The M14's mechanism groaned, half-frozen grease making it sluggish. The AK's handle, crusted white, broke free with a single strike from a gloved hand. Then, clack! The first shot cracked across the range, a puff of vapor drifting from the muzzle like a sigh. The men just stared. They tried again. Saltwater immersion this time. 24 hours submerged. They left it to dry naturally. No oil, no care. The Garand misfired after the first clip. The M14's bolt seized. The AK coughed once, then kept firing as though nothing had happened. By the end of the week, Hayes had a wall of data pinned across the lab. Graphs of malfunction rates, temperature tolerances, barrel fouling, and corrosion patterns. The pattern was undeniable. Where American engineering demanded cleanliness and control, Soviet design absorbed chaos and turned it into function. During one late-night test, Hayes stayed alone with the AK. The others had gone. He loaded a fresh magazine, aimed at a rusted oil drum at 50 meters, and fired on full auto until the barrel glowed red. Steam rose from the receiver like breath from a horse in winter. When he finally stopped, he set it on the bench and just watched it cool. He thought about the man who had built it, Mikhail Kalashnikov, a name he'd seen scrawled in the Russian documents they'd intercepted. A tank sergeant, not a scientist, a wounded soldier, not an engineer. And yet somehow that man had understood something no committee of Western designers ever did, that the battlefield doesn't reward elegance. It rewards endurance. The next morning, Hayes gathered his team. "Gentlemen," he said, "I've seen weapons that were smarter, faster, more expensive. But this thing—" He lifted the AK with both hands, the steel dull and scarred. "This thing is faithful. It doesn't care who you are, how trained you are, or what you believe. You pull the trigger and it answers, every time." The men were silent. In the corner, the M14 prototype sat untouched, its blued finish already pitted with rust. That night, Hayes sent his first formal report to Washington. "Recommend immediate study of Soviet intermediate caliber rifle design. The AK-47 demonstrates reliability unmatched by current U.S. service weapons under environmental stress. If mass-produced, it represents a global shift in infantry warfare." He hesitated before signing it, because what he'd written wasn't just a report, it was a warning. The Cold War wasn't going to be fought in laboratories or air bases. It was going to be fought in jungles, deserts, mountains, and alleys, and the winner wouldn't be the nation with the most advanced gun. It would be the one with the gun that never stopped firing. February 3, 1951, Tokyo Military Research Facility. The room smelled of graphite, stale coffee, and spent powder. Hayes stood before the polished oak table where 3 colonels and a brigadier general sat waiting for his report. His notes, 30 pages thick, smudged with fingerprints and oil, lay open in front of him. He had been awake for 36 hours. The numbers still danced behind his eyelids. 600 rounds per minute, 0 malfunctions after submersion, minus 40 degrees tolerance. But what haunted him wasn't the data. It was what it meant. He cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, I believe we've underestimated what the Soviets are capable of." The general didn't look impressed. "Major, with respect, this is one rifle. We have an entire arsenal of proven weapons. You're saying this one, farm tool, changes the balance?" Hayes nodded. "Yes, sir, exactly that." He walked to the table, laid the Soviet rifle beside the Garand. Two worlds of philosophy separated by a few inches of wood. This weapon is designed to function when it shouldn't. It forgives neglect. It thrives in dirt. It's not precision engineering. It's mechanical instinct. Every soldier, trained or not, can use it and trust it. That's what makes it dangerous. The general leaned back, unimpressed. "Dangerous? Major, this isn't the first time the Russians have made something ugly that works. It doesn't mean they'll win wars with it." Hayes wanted to agree. He really did. But the truth pressed too heavy on his chest. "Sir, I've watched our rifles jam in the same conditions where this one keeps firing. If the Soviets armed 10 million men with these, they don't need better training or strategy. They just need time." He paused, then added softly, "They're building a weapon for the world, not just for their army." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the colonels laughed quietly. "You make it sound like a religion, Major." Hayes met his gaze. "Maybe it is." When the meeting ended, he walked out into the corridor, feeling hollow. He knew the report would be filed, dissected, and buried under layers of bureaucracy. But he also knew that somewhere in Moscow, a man named Mikhail Kalashnikov was doing what no American boardroom could, giving the world something it didn't know it needed yet. That night, Hayes joined a group of Marines recently rotated from the front. They sat in the mess, their faces burned by wind and frostbite, their laughter loud and reckless. One of them, a corporal from Wisconsin, pulled an object from his duffel and dropped it on the table. An AK-47. "Picked it off a Chinese officer near Udimni," he said. "Thing was half buried, still fired like a dream." Hayes froze. "May I?" The Marine grinned. "Be my guest, sir." He lifted the rifle, felt its balance, the same coarse metal, the same oily wood scarred by use. He aimed at nothing, squeezed the trigger. Click. The dry snap echoed through the hall. The corporal leaned forward. "You ask me, sir. We got it backwards. We keep making rifles for clean wars. They're making rifles for dirty ones." Hayes said nothing. He just stared at the weapon, the rough welds, the uneven rivets, the ugly perfection of it. For the first time, he realized this wasn't just an engineering revelation. It was a moral one. The Soviets had built a gun that erased the line between soldier and peasant, between army and insurgent. It made war democratic. It gave power to anyone with a trigger finger and a will. He left the mess hall and stood outside under the winter moon, his breath curling white in the night. Somewhere out there, in the mountains of Korea, the jungles of Vietnam yet to come, the deserts of Africa he hadn't even heard of, that same rifle would keep talking long after men like him were gone. In his notebook, he wrote his final observation for the report. The AK-47 is not a weapon, it's a philosophy in steel, built on the belief that simplicity is stronger than sophistication, and survival is the only measure of success. He stared at those words until the ink bled into the paper. He felt pride, fear, and something that tasted like defeat. Because deep down, Major Robert Hayes understood what the generals didn't. America's greatest rival hadn't just built a rifle. They had built the future, one that couldn't be stopped by mud, ice, or politics. March 1951, Yokota Air Base, Japan. The war in Korea raged on, but for Major Robert Hayes, the front line had moved to a quieter battlefield, his own mind. Every morning, he woke to the sound of jets taking off over the fog-shrouded runway, their engines trembling through the thin walls of his office. On his desk lay two things: a brass coffee mug and the same Soviet rifle, stripped bare for study. The weapon no longer frightened him. It fascinated him and unsettled him in equal measure. He'd spent weeks breaking it down, measuring, sketching, documenting, but no amount of diagrams could capture the strange soul that seemed to live inside the steel. It was alive in a way American weapons weren't. He watched it perform in test after test. It fired when buried. It fired when frozen. It fired when scraped, dented, soaked, or neglected. It didn't complain. It didn't care. It simply did what it was made to do, every single time. And with each successful test, Hayes felt something shift inside him, a slow erosion of certainty. He had built a career on the faith that complexity meant superiority, that progress meant precision. But now he knew better. In the mud, the perfect weapon wasn't the smartest or the prettiest. It was the one that refused to die. When the last report was sealed and flown to Washington, Hayes sat alone in the hangar and watched a C-54 transport take off for home. In its cargo bay were 3 rifles, an M1, an M14 prototype, and that one Soviet gun with its stock still scarred from Chosin's ice. He knew they would vanish into the system, studied, dissected, debated. But what they represented would outlive every bureaucrat who ever stamped the paperwork. That night, he wrote to his wife, Margaret, "You'd laugh if you saw the thing that's been keeping me up at night. It's not a jet or a bomb. It's a rifle. An ugly little Russian rifle that shouldn't work, but does. I think sometimes the world changes quietly, without anyone noticing. Not with explosions, but with mechanisms that refuse to break." Months later, when Hayes returned to the States, the war had hardened into a stalemate. Men came home maimed or buried under medals, and America turned its eyes toward the Cold War, to missiles, to speed, to space. But Hayes couldn't shake the memory of that moment in the snow at Chosin, the sharp metallic cough of that weapon defying the cold. He was promoted, transferred to Aberdeen Proving Ground, the same facility that years later would test the RPG-7. His office overlooked a field of rusting prototypes, American brilliance that never made it past the drawing board, all of them precise, complicated, and, in their own way, failures. Sometimes, in the quiet, he'd take the Soviet rifle from its case and hold it in his hands. The serial number had half worn away. The wood was dull now, the smell of oil long gone. But when he pulled the bolt back, it still made that same satisfying clack, solid, final, inevitable. He realized then that no matter how the war has changed, Korea, Vietnam, the jungles, the deserts, this sound would remain. It was the sound of the modern battlefield, the rhythm of every revolution, the voice of every man too poor for tanks but too angry to kneel. And in that realization came the quiet grief of understanding. The weapon he had once studied had already escaped control. It belonged to the world now, to every cause, every corner, every century that refused to stay still. As the sun went down over the proving ground, Hayes whispered to the empty room, "We thought we were fighting communism. We were fighting an idea, and the idea had already been forged in steel." 1975. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The world had changed, or at least it thought it had. The Vietnam War had just ended, and America was licking wounds deeper than statistics could measure. On the television in the officers' lounge, grainy footage rolled, helicopters lifting off from Saigon rooftops, soldiers throwing equipment into the sea, the faces of men who'd stopped believing in victory. Colonel Robert Hayes, now 60, watched in silence. In one clip, a North Vietnamese soldier walked into the U.S. Embassy courtyard holding a rifle over his head. Curved magazine, stamped receiver, black wood, the same sound, the same silhouette. After 25 years, he turned down the volume and whispered to himself, "We built the sky. They owned the ground." He still kept the original AK locked in his office safe, the one from Chosin, the one that had started it all. Every year he requested to keep it, and every year some clerk signed off, unaware that it was more relic than weapon now. The blued finish had faded to gray. The stock was cracked, but it was still whole, still capable of speaking with the pull of a trigger. On his desk lay folders filled with test reports from across the world. Israeli armor ambushed by Egyptian infantry using Soviet rifles and RPGs. Cuban soldiers carrying AKs in Angola. Afghan guerrillas, decades later, firing the same design against Soviet tanks. Every headline seemed to orbit the same truth. One man's invention had slipped the leash of politics and become an ecosystem of war. He once told a junior engineer, "Weapons don't die, they reproduce." That engineer laughed. Hayes didn't. He'd seen the reproduction firsthand. The Type 56 from China, the M70 from Yugoslavia, the East German MPI-KM, each a slightly altered child of the original. Factories had multiplied across continents like seeds scattered by wind. The Soviets had built 6 million, the Chinese 10 million more. By then, there were enough AKs in the world to arm every man in the Red Army 10 times over. At the Pentagon briefing in 1976, a young officer half Hayes's age called it a global infestation. Hayes corrected him gently, "No, Lieutenant, it's an evolution." He could see the discomfort in the young man's eyes. The truth always made people uneasy, that the Soviet weapons genius lay not in power, but in permission. It gave the smallest fighter a voice. It turned rebellion into arithmetic. A crate of rifles and a few boxes of ammunition could reshape a nation faster than any speech ever written. That was its real legacy. Hayes would later visit museums where the AK-47 hung behind glass between relics of empire, a rifle beside flags and manifestos. But even behind the glass, it didn't look like history. It looked alive, restless, as if it wanted to escape. He thought of Mikhail Kalashnikov. He had never met the man, but he felt as if they shared an invisible bond. Two soldiers born from opposite sides of the same century, both engineers, both dreamers of order in a world built on chaos. When he read the interview decades later, in which Kalashnikov said he felt sorrow for the deaths caused by his creation, Hayes understood. He'd written something similar in his own notebook years earlier. "I don't blame the machine. It has no soul to blame. It's us who keep giving it reasons to exist." In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, Hayes retired. But even then, he knew the rifle wouldn't fade with the ideology that made it. The AK had outlasted communism itself. It had become what every weapon secretly dreams of becoming: eternal. In his final lecture at Aberdeen, he faced a room of young officers and engineers. None of them had seen Chosin. Few had even heard of the early tests, but every one of them knew the name Kalashnikov. He held up the rifle, the same one he'd found in that frozen valley so long ago. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is not just steel and wood. It's proof that simplicity can rule the world. You can bury it in mud, leave it in snow, hand it to a boy who's never held a gun, and it will work. That's not genius of design. That's genius of understanding human nature." He paused, his voice quieting. "The future will build smarter weapons, but none will ever be wiser than this one." When he finished, no one clapped. They just sat in silence, the kind of silence that follows truth. Outside, a new era was dawning: microchips, satellites, guided munitions. But in distant deserts and jungles, the old rifle still coughed its same short bursts, its sound carrying through generations. Hayes walked out of the lecture hall, the weight of the weapon in his hands, and felt the wind off the Chesapeake cut through his coat. He smiled, tired and proud, and whispered to himself, "History forgets faces, but steel remembers hands." Colonel Robert Hayes passed away in 1992, sitting quietly on his porch in Maryland. His hands, the same hands that once held that captured rifle in the snow of Chosin, were folded in his lap. The weapon itself was still in his possession, resting in an oiled cloth inside a wooden chest beneath the stairs. When his daughter opened the chest after his funeral, she found a single note taped to the rifle stock. The handwriting was firm, deliberate. The world keeps inventing better ways to destroy itself, but sometimes the simplest invention never needs improving. She left the note untouched. The rifle went to a museum, behind glass and alarms, but the words went further, reprinted, quoted, echoed in military journals and documentaries that spoke his name as if he were part of the weapon's long, restless shadow. Decades later, long after the Cold War had dissolved into memory, soldiers were still carrying its legacy. In deserts, in forests, in the narrow alleys of broken cities, the same sound persisted, that unmistakable clack-clack before a burst of fire. Every generation thinks it invents war anew, but in truth, war only changes shape. The tools stay the same, the lessons rarely learned. Hayes had understood that too well. The AK-47 was more than just the perfect rifle, it was a mirror, showing how easily mankind embraces the tools of survival even when they promise destruction. He once wrote, "In the end, the greatest weapon isn't the gun. It's the idea that we still need one." So tonight, if you're listening to this story somewhere safe, maybe in your living room, maybe through headphones while the world outside hums with peace hard-won, remember that every quiet hour was bought by men who once stood in the snow holding a rifle they barely understood. The AK-47 is still out there, in fields, in hands, in headlines. It has outlived the nations that built it, outlasted the wars it was made for, and whispered one message across 70 years of human history: simplicity endures, complexity fails, and somewhere between them, humanity keeps trying to remember why it fights at all. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Tell me your city, and tell me this: do you think humanity will ever build something powerful, not meant to kill?